The early proponents of the market economy are themselves the victims of its success on BBC Two now in the final chapter of the Mayfair Set.
Britain's power and influence has declined since the beginning of the century. And the question is this a trend we can reverse?
We are concerned with making money. That is what we're trying to do.
It's been described as the most beautiful terrace house in London.
The abuse of business and financial power.
You lied. We shall have a harder Christmas than we have known since the war.
Economic activity is best left to the private sector, with market forces being encouraged to operate.
Come with us, then, towards the next decade. Let us together set our sights on a Britain where 3 out of 4 families own their home, where owning shares is as common...
During the election of 1987, Mrs. Thatcher celebrated an economic boom, created, she said, by the power of the free market.
A Britain where there is a resurgence of enterprise, with more people self-employed, more businesses, and therefore more jobs.
But 5,000 miles away, in the Mexican jungle, an old tycoon brooded. He was James Goldsmith, and he had been pushed aside by the boom. He now believed that Mrs. Thatcher's government had lost control of the economy. They had been taken over by the power they had unleashed, the force of the global markets. And that night, as Mrs. Thatcher rode to victory, another embittered tycoon sulked in his London house. He was Tiny Rowland, and he too had been marginalised by the onrush of the economy. Rowland believed that the Conservative Party had been corrupted by the boom. Both these men wanted vengeance for their loss of power, and both now set out to destroy the Conservative Party. And they would be joined by a third vengeful tycoon who had been cast aside. He knew that the government had become corrupted by the growing power of money. All these men had helped to bring the markets to power. But now they wanted someone to reassert control over the monster they had created. But what they got was not quite what they expected. In the early 1970s, Goldsmith and Rowland had been glamorous, powerful figures. The Conservative government, led by Edward Heath, had created a boom by pumping money into the economy. The stock market soared ever upwards, and the new tycoons used the power this gave them to take over some of the biggest companies in Britain. They were seen as men who would create a new, prosperous Britain. When Goldsmith took over the giant food company Bovril, he ruthlessly sold off any part that didn't make a profit for the shareholders.
They were going to rejuvenate British business that was moribund, and Britain too. They were bringing a new dynamic of ruthlessness that was necessary to clean out some of these businesses, get rid of, indulgences, you might say, in businesses, work for the shareholders, and people were believing it. Shareholders were believing and getting on the coattails of these people. I think there was a fair amount of massaging of paper and the proliferation of paper in these takeovers, which cost many people a great deal in the long term.
But back then?
Back then it was seen as a renaissance of British business.
Now, this is Mr. Rowland. Mr. Rowland and Amini wa manjamu.
Tiny Rowland was doing the same in Africa. He was taking over the old British-owned companies that had once dominated the empire. Rowland used ruthless methods to build a vast industrial empire. This included bribing the new rulers of independent Africa. They were methods that shocked the merchant banks in the City of London. And his bank, Warburg's, resigned because he was uncontrollable.
I think his determination was fully matched by his corruption, and he was utterly ruthless. The ends to which he would go to achieve his broader objective, I think were a great deal further than anyone else. That I always found quite worrying. I never felt that he and we would have the same ideas as to where the cutoff line was.
But then, in 1973, the tycoons' brief moment of power was destroyed. The stock market crashed disastrously. The Conservatives' boom had turned sour. It had led to inflation and industrial violence. And in November, the Arab oil price rise pushed the market over the edge. It fell further than in the crash of 1929. The politicians now turned on the tycoons. When Rowland's corrupt methods were revealed, Edward Heath publicly called him the unacceptable face of capitalism. And Goldsmith was now seen as a greedy spiv who had torn British industry apart to make himself a fortune. He left England to go and live in America. It was also the end of the idea that politicians could control the economy. Ever since the war, governments of both left and right had believed that they could manage the economy by varying spending and taxation. But now, the chaos produced by the Conservative boom overwhelmed the new Labour government. They finally admitted that they had lost control of the economy.
We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked on each occasion since the war by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy on every occasion, followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step.
Tell you what I don't want to see.
What's that?
Labour in power again.
Labour in power? Was that the Marx Brothers?
No, another bunch of comedians.
Coming shortly, the Conservatives.
In 1979, Mrs. Thatcher was elected. She believed that all attempts by governments to manage the economy were doomed and led to disaster. The crash of 1973, she was convinced, had been created by Heath's attempts to control the economy. Instead, she was going to give up power and let the free market operate with as little regulation as possible.
I think a great deal of the idea of the power of the government was illusion. It was perhaps true in the 19th century. It was no longer true in a world becoming increasingly globalized. One has to give up trying to control. One of the first things we did, and it was a very significant one, was to get rid of exchange control. Remember, still in 1979, you had to get permission to change more than small amounts of money into other currencies, because we were trying to control the price of sterling. It always failed. And from there on, we realized that it was the way to go, to de-restrict, to deregulate, and to let the market operate.
When the Conservatives removed exchange controls, they opened Britain up to the growing force of the international financial markets. Money could now move in and out of the country at will. It meant that the bankers in the City of London were now free to raise huge amounts of money from anywhere in the world. They could then use that capital to finance the buying and selling of hundreds of companies. And in the process, the bankers, not the politicians, would change Britain.
When exchange control came off, suddenly the floodgates were open. And we realized that we were actually going to go through a period where change was going to happen. And we were in a position to make it happen. And we were the only people in a position to make it happen. And people like myself saw that you could do things which before had never been done because of those restrictions. And now they were gone. The world was the oyster. play with, to finance, to arrange finance, to